Hello and welcome to the final part of the SC Media UK and Adarma's Minimising the Impact of a Breach series. All links to the series can be found below your video screen. My name's Catherine Cave. I'm the Associate Editor of SC Media and your host for the next hour. In this session, we're going to find out why Clarks, that very familiar staple of the UK High Street, decided to take a fresh D&R direction. We're going to look at the decisions they had to make, the hurdles they're overcoming, and the outcomes and improvements they made. This should be a very frank discussion, and we're hoping it'll be very useful for you to see the context of how all of this works in practice. So if there's anything you want to understand for the purposes of your business, please do send your questions by using the box below the video screen, and we're going to have a Q&A at the end of the session. So without further delay, let me hand you over to our fantastic speakers to introduce themselves. So first of all, I've got Sean Kingdom, who's from Clarks. Perhaps you could introduce yourself.
Hi, Catherine. Yeah, thanks so much for having me along. I'm really looking forward to discussing my experiences today, and hopefully those provide useful for some of you if you sort of thinking about the journey or you're partway along the MDR journey, and hopefully some of the lessons that I've learned on that journey can be of use to you. So I have a background in broader risk and compliance and assurance, and a keen passion for data privacy and cybersecurity. So having joined Clarks in 2014, I then took the head of cybersecurity risk management role in 2019 and have been there ever since.
Lovely, thank you very much. So next we've got Rory Shannon, who's Managed Service Director at Adarma. Perhaps you can introduce yourself.
Hi everybody, and thank you all for attending today. So my name is Rory Shannon. I'm as Catherine said, the Managed Services Director for Adarma. I've been with the company just over 8 years now, and almost exclusively during that time been focused on SOC and MDR services for our customers. It's something I'm incredibly passionate about and can speak for hours on, although I'll try and restrict my ramblings a little bit today. But I think the purposes, I guess, from today is for Sean and I to have a really open discussion between both a client and a vendor or a partner around some of the things that we've seen go really well with kind of MDR selections and implementations, and also some recommendations that we've kind of both seen during our time in various organizations around kind of where these some of the questions that are really important to ask that sometimes you don't get asked, and some of the key outcomes that we think are critical to making sure that you select the right partner when making as significant a decision as ultimately your first line detective set of controls within your SOC environment. So really looking forward to discussing with Sean today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's just start with a bit of context. Sean, I think we're all familiar with Clarks as a shop. Takes many of us from the first day at school to your, grand's most comfortable footwear. But can you tell me about what changed your thinking about security, specific areas of vulnerability, behaviours, trends, any incidents really that prompted the need for this?
Absolutely, yeah, and it probably helps to rehearse the sort of further background to demonstrate that the journey to MDR isn't something that, certainly for us anyway, was an overnight kind of revelation. It was something that bubbled along for a while and kind of evolved naturally. And we're really fortunate. You see a lot of organisations that do suffer a major incident, and that's the trigger for a cyber transformation program or maybe an investment within sort of defence and response. And for us, it was quite different actually. We were very fortunate. And it's perhaps a tale in good governance that we had a very strong audit committee on our main board, and they were looking as they do at the kind of principal risks for the organisation, those kind of top 10 strategic risks that could knock us off track of our kind of strategic objectives. This was long before COVID was even a thing we could dream about, and naturally cybersecurity was one of those kind of top 10 principal risks. And so they started to ask questions, recognizing that what had been done before had been perfectly adequate. There were no failings, as I said, no major incidents to speak home of. But it was time to recognise that the cyber landscape was evolving. The threats were getting ever more persistent and ever more complex. Ransomware had moved from being something that just affected home users looking for a $600 ransom to targeting organisations and looking for multi-million ransomware kind of payments. So they had a look and realized that we needed to up our investment and up our sort of prioritization of cybersecurity. And we took a maturity-based approach to our cyber program. We got some sort of leading cybersecurity consultants in to help us kind of understand where Clarks was on the maturity journey as of that moment, recognizing that the world had moved on. And it found across we used the NIST cybersecurity framework, and we recognized that there were areas across all of the 5 domains that we wanted to improve upon. And we actually took a strategic decision that the detect and response were the areas that we were going to prioritize first, and took a mantra of get good quickly. The sort of detection and response up to now had been dealt with by the existing cybersecurity team, in and amongst their business as usual work. And of course, there's always a conflict of trying to deliver improvements whilst also responding to alerts, and not necessarily having the time, capacity, and investment to continually improve that kind of effort. So like I said, we took the decision to prioritize detection and response, recognizing that whilst, protection is really important, you can't be right 100% of the time. And there's that kind of cybersecurity sort of saying that goes around that, you have to be right, a defender has to be right 100% of the time, an attacker only has to be right once. But of course, recognizing that cybersecurity is more than just protection, which is, certainly for our stakeholders is something that they believed. We actually kind of moved in the direction of saying, well, hold up, if we can get really, really good very quickly at detecting potential incidents and responding and remediating those incidents, it buys you the time to make the protection improvements that you need to do in terms of that defense in depth. So that was the decision we took. And, recognizing that we wanted to get good quickly, it was evident, I think, very quickly that the managed defense and response was the right option for us. When you looked at the cost and the time it would take to recruit a team, to deploy the relevant technologies, to get the right log sources, to do the fine tuning, to train that team, was far going to outweigh bringing the partner in like Adarma to, as I say, get us good quickly in that area. So that really was the journey for us. And I think my kind of takeaway from the background, it was that once we were at the point where we could sort of answer 3 kind of core questions, was the time that we could then go out to the market and start to engage potential vendors through sort of RFIs and RFPs, etc. And for me, it was kind of 3 things. One is, what are you trying to achieve with your defense and response strategy? Why specifically are you looking at MDR versus, I don't know, maybe a co-source solution or a totally in-house solution? And finally, how does that fit within your broader kind of cybersecurity strategy and your broader program? Because, these are key questions for you to make sure you're getting the right service from any potential vendors. But also that's really important then when you're trying to sell, which, let's be honest, isn't a small contract, to your internal stakeholders and necessarily kind of internal governance procedures. So that was the journey to making the decision to proceed down the MDR path.
It's really interesting there, Sean, actually, when you talk about choosing to work on MDR first, the detection side of things. And I think it's a really kind of well-founded decision. Actually, I think the preventive controls are often where people start. You kind of then have an assumption that they work. And I think being able to invest in the kind of DNR side of things to then test those preventative controls, make sure that if they're working, and as you say, then being able to kind of respond effectively, really starts giving you insight, I think, into the business that potentially you wouldn't have without that investment, and then focus elsewhere on, we understand as a result of an effective detection function where the weaknesses are around the prevent side of things. And just I guess, do you kind of agree with that? Is that something that was part of your decisions and has helped then to inform the rest of the strategic kind of security program over the last couple of years as we've been kind of working on that detection and response side of the fence, if you like?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Rory. And absolutely, I'd agree. It's a really good way of providing assurance internally without necessarily, I would always advocate going off and getting pen tests and both technical and kind of paper-based assurance through internal audit, maturity assessments, etc. But you're right, you get real-time data and real-time information on the quality of your controls. You're starting to see where those weaknesses are. If those defense in depth, as I said earlier, you get an ability to recognize that perhaps one of those controls just isn't quite operating as effectively as you like, or recognizing that you may not, within the challenges of the business environment, be able to necessarily put those preventative controls as strict as you might like without hampering the progress of the business. And that's what we have to do as security professionals, is find the right balance between security and usability for our users and for our customers. So I completely agree with you there. And I think that the other thing as well that was interesting was as I said, our stakeholders, when you're talking sort of C-level executives and board level executives, I think there's a misconception that security is all about prevention. And as I said, that's why I'm a really big fan of the NIST cybersecurity framework, because you have got those 5 pillars of identify, protection, detection, response, and recovery. And those are really good day-to-day layman terms that really help to articulate your defense strategy across all of those areas. We might have known it as the kill chain or whatever kind of terms we've heard of. But for me, I'm a really big fan of the NIST cybersecurity framework for that purpose.
Thank you very much. So that's very interesting and sets the context very well. So, moving sort of through that sort of journey a little bit, maybe Rory, can you tell me a bit about sort of the start of your working relationship, what your initial reactions were, sort of along with proposed solutions and how you presented them?
Yeah, absolutely. And we were kind of, when deciding, I think there's actually the implementation of the technology itself, but, the relationship goes back kind of 6 months before that. In terms of the selection. And I think one of the bits that I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about is essentially, the decision-making process of a client and also a supplier, to ensuring that when you enter into a partnership such as MDR, which is often, is a significant cost, it's multi-year, that essentially you're comfortable that you're making the right decision. And I think first and foremost, when you're looking to purchase or invest in a managed detection response function, one of the key things for me is recognizing that this is not just a technology implementation. I think very often, or occasionally, what we will see is a very, very technical kind of RFP that's submitted by clients, which focuses essentially on how would you do X? How would you ingest data source X into the system? And very often there's a right way of answering that. There's a correct answer. And actually, if you're going to multiple suppliers, they're all going to answer that question in a very kind of similar way. And I think what really excited us about working with Clarks was very much an outcome-led discussion in the RFP. There was obviously technical questions there. You need to make sure that we do know what we're talking about from a technical perspective. But as this is a partnership where you're going to be working closely with each other for a long time, you need to make sure that the ethos of how we work is in line with customers, in line, kind of together. So I guess there was a couple of things really for me that was quite pleasing. Firstly, and perhaps selfishly, Clarks did give us some time to respond when the RFP was submitted. We've had RFPs sometimes come in the past where you get 4 or 5 days to conduct a response, and at that point, very often you're kind of essentially assessing who has the fastest or biggest bid management program, rather than necessarily kind of answering the MDR question. So we had some time to put thought into the answers and get a really coherent and mature response back. But the fact that it was then very much so 2 things I think were really pleasing for me is Clarks had a vision of what they wanted to achieve with MDR. And as a result of that, it was quite an open set of questions. And as a result of that, we essentially put a suite of offerings together that included kind of SOC and SIEM, also included EDR, and it also included vulnerability management. And I think when we started to stitch a number of the services together, what we kind of essentially managed to kind of construct with Clarks is a service that meets all of their key outcomes, and essentially allowed Sean and the team to go to the CFO and say, this is what we're going to achieve with this implementation, rather than this is what this technical solution can provide. And I think focusing on that key business outcomes is really critical. I mean, the reality is that for most organizations, that they're not generating revenue from security. Security allows the generation of revenue through the ultimate business requirements. And for Clarks, it's selling footwear. And we need to make sure that when we're building a SOC service, the controls that we're choosing to implement, the approach that we're choosing to take, allows that business to function effectively. And Sean kind of made a really good point there. It's about balancing business requirements with security. Perhaps in an ideal world, you'd be locking absolutely everything down. But then what happens to the marketing department who can't update relevant feeds or can't kind of submit things out there? You potentially like to put thresholding into your customer websites, but what happens when you have a massive sale on and people want to visit the website? You kind of can't start limiting the business outcomes. And that's something that's I guess really was kind of really interesting when we started going through the answer. I think we then kind of, I guess once we kind of submitted the responses and given clerks enough time to digest them, I assume there was probably quite a number of submissions. You know, it takes a bit of time to go through that and really kind of actually start to dive into whether or not you agree with what the provider is saying, kind of at a, hesitant to use the word philosophical level, but I kind of will, around how we do SOC. We then both kind of spent a bit of time visiting each other. Now I appreciate that's not been particularly easy over the last couple of years, but it was pleasing. It was just before the world went, you know, a little bit off piste, and we went down to visit Clark's, and then Clark's and team came up to visit us and visit our SOC, and that again was really, you know, nice to see. Clark's were interested in seeing who's actually going to operate this service, not just who's selling the service. And by, you know, bringing in some of the analysts, meeting the management team from a delivery perspective, and we're able to kind of get around the table and kind of talk SOC, talk shop, talk SOC, in a way that managed to very much agree quickly that actually we felt this was a right fit. You know, because ultimately this is a multi-year partnership, and somebody often says to me, you know, at some point over 3 years things are going to get tough. There's going to be a circumstance where something happens, and we need, you know, potentially we don't agree on things, or that potentially, you know, there is a significant attack. You need somebody that's there to respond quickly. So a lot of the decision is not so much around who do you want, you know, delivering the service when everything's going perfectly, but it's who do you want standing behind you and standing with you when things do go wrong. And I think we managed to get a good feel for each other during that kind of RFP and that response process. So, you know, I think, yeah, very much the first kind of, I think probably 4 or 5 months, Sean, was around that kind of selection process from initial kind of written responses to the various visits, you know, a lot of deep workshopping sessions to make sure that we were the right fit, and then ultimately into the kind of implementation of the project itself. But, you know, there's a lot of work that has to come before that. And, you know, one piece of advice I would have is don't underestimate the amount of work that has to go in from a client side at an RFP stage, because I can imagine, Sean, for you, it was probably as much work or close to as much work as the actual project implementation itself.
Absolutely, completely agree with, you know, all of your points there, Rory, and you hit the nail on the head. You know, there's a lot of work that goes into the RFP, and actually, you know, the more work you do up front for the RFP, the better it runs. You know, there's that kind of cliche of, you know, if you fail to prepare, then you prepare to fail. And I think it's sort of an RFP for MDR services is exactly one of those situations where that kind of cliche really hits home. And I think a couple of things that I learned along the way, and I certainly can't take credit for some of the directions we took here. We had some excellent, you know, security colleagues, both inside and outside, and my procurement colleagues that really helped that journey, but learned some really great kind of key lessons that hopefully, you know, others on this journey can kind of pick up on. And one of those that kind of struck home compared with a perhaps more traditional technical RFP was actually kind of two things. One is being able to trust your potential suppliers, you know, actually asking them questions about how should your organization achieve this particular objective, rather than, as Rory said, setting out that, you know, we want X number of alerts per day, because actually, is that the right thing for your organization? And I think, you know, there's always a little bit sort of a nervous situation in an RFP, because, you know, I guess there's that fear of, you know, is a vendor going to take a bit of flexibility and sort of an open question and run with it and try and oversell to you. And I guess if you can't trust a potential supplier to advise you appropriately during an RFP, you probably can't trust them to actually run your MDR service. I mean, ultimately, you know, your MDR service is one of your last lines of defense against, you know, potentially a major cyber incident. And you could at times be really relying upon their support. So I think you have to get comfortable with trusting them, and you have to get comfortable with it being a two-way dialogue. You know, you need to be prepared for them to challenge you. And I think, you know, for me, the vendors that shone in our sort of RFP process were those vendors that did come back and say, well, you've got options here. You could do it like this, as you've kind of described there, or you could achieve the same objective by taking this approach. And that was something that we saw from a few of the vendors that was quite refreshing, actually. I think another thing that I would sort of raise as a bit of a red flag during the RFP process, and I'm sure this is something that many of you have seen numerous times before, is there are some vendors out there who are very skilled at responding to RFPs. They've almost got it down to an absolute art form. And I think, you know, the open question approach is a really good way of getting under the surface, and actually, as Rory said, maybe understanding some of the philosophical decisions of how would you respond to X, Y, Z, rather than just sort of, you know, being delivered with high level numbers. You know, having 700 use cases versus 7 versus 70 use cases. Now, the 700 sounds fantastic, but actually, is that the right option for you? Are you just going to get delivered with a lot of noise? Is 7 enough? So it's really having that dialogue with the vendors to get to the right solution, and then you can start talking sort of hard tax.
And I think that point there, and almost the number of detections, is something that we see a lot. You know, our approach is a little bit different to turning on some snort detections and calling it a SOC. But you know what? Again, I understand that you know, at an RFP stage, it's often uncomfortable to kind of, you know, air some of the challenges that an organization might face. But certainly, as you start to kind of down select and getting to maybe 2 or 3 different options, you know, having a level of comfort, as Sean said, and a bit of trust in the preferred supplier, to tell them where, you know, what are the compelling reasons for your investment in a SOC? Why is the CFO signed this money off? Because it's generally not to have the best SOC in the world. It's to meet a set of business outcomes that allow the business to continue to deliver. And you know, if you're able to share those key risks, some of the key findings that, you know, where you understand your areas are weak, that allows you to kind of test the response, almost kind of on the hoof of the suppliers or of the partners. So how would you respond? Our biggest threat, for example, is data loss, or we're concerned about the theft of IP, or we're concerned about, you know, ransomware. There's a number of responses or ways that we can potentially articulate that. And I think that, for me, making sure that your initial go live content can serve to reduce risk and go up to your operational risk board and say, well, actually, you know, risk number 1 for us is theft of IP, which is often something in retailers that is important. And therefore, we're going to deploy the following content or the following controls that then help us mitigate that risk. And that, for me, is I believe, a more compelling way to ensure that you can get funding for your SOC than, you know, we're going to have 600 out of the box use cases. And the question is, well, what do they do? You say, well, we're not entirely sure, but we're promised them there's lots of out of the box use cases. And that business alignment is just something that is so important as you start to get to the nuts and bolts of essentially securing funding for the investments that you're looking to make.
That's a really great point there, Rory. And yeah, you're right. The reality is, an MDR service, you would, you know, you're hoping is going to be at least a 3-year life cycle, if not much longer. And the reality is that you're not going to walk into your CFO office and get sign off on a contract of that size and that length and that strategic alignment overnight. You know, if you are, then you're incredibly lucky to have a CFO who really understands, you know, the space, or is, you know, heavily invested in cybersecurity. And, you know, I once heard from a CFO that the job of the CFO is just being constantly asked for money by different departments across the business. So I think in terms of securing funding for an agreement like this, and for a service like this, you know, you really need to engage early with your CFO and with the other kind of key stakeholders who are going to be involved in that kind of sign off. And you want to make sure that's really understood up front before you go through the RFP. And the other thing there is that, you know, we need to be really good at articulating what are the risks and benefits here. I think, you know, as the GDPR was coming to force, there was a window where, you know, privacy and security professionals could sort of point to the 4% of turnover under the GDPR, and that was a really good sort of, you know, for most organizations, that's quite a big number, and a really good way of securing sort of funding for various kind of privacy and security initiatives. I think CFOs and other kind of approvers have sort of grown wary of that now and said, well, show me the various kind of penalties. And yes, there's been some notable ones, but actually, you know, we need to get really, really good at articulating what are the core business objectives and how are there risks that could jeopardize those, and how would this particular service help to mitigate those? And ultimately, you know, for us as a retailer, you know, how is that going to help to us to ensure that we design the right product, that we procure and source the right product, and then that we can then sell it to our customers, and making sure that you clearly articulate that before you go off and try and get approval for funding.
Thank you very much, and that's very helpful and I think very useful advice on speaking to stakeholders, especially in the sort of more financial part of the organisation. Can you tell me a bit more on the proposed solutions and the implementation, please, Sean?
Absolutely. So as I said, yes, you do really need to engage with your stakeholders early, and that actually extends beyond your kind of financial improvers. But some sort of lessons I learned through this implementation stage is that this really is a team effort. It starts from the security team. But it very, very, very quickly broadens out to other areas of IT and almost all areas of IT, if I'm being completely honest. And I think something that surprised me and I learned quite quickly through this process is just the number of stakeholders that need to be involved in this kind of process and in this kind of implementation journey. And the earlier that you stand those stakeholders up, the earlier that you get their buy-in and their engagement to the process is better. And to be completely honest, get them engaged during the RFP process. It may not be as part of the vendor selection, but certainly in terms of writing requirements and providing the kind of technical information that's going to be a key part of the implementation. It's all very quickly, as you're trying to get log sources, you realize that you're bumping into your kind of infrastructure colleagues, your networks colleagues, your servers colleagues. So that was something that we learned very, very, very quickly. Something else we learned kind of looking at the various proposals and that we recognize within ourselves is that there's actually a huge number of unknowns, and therefore you need to be able to be comfortable that you can flex and be adaptable with your kind of implementation plan. Every vendor will come to you with a kind of traditional waterfall slide and tell you that they will get the service live in X number of weeks or X number of months, and a kind of the racy chart of who's responsible for what. But the reality is that you're going to bump into unknowns and challenges that you couldn't have foreseen, and as well you need to be really effective at prioritizing. So you're making sure that you're delivering the right log sources to deliver the right use cases to get early benefit from the service. Something that we did, this was something that Adarma brought to the table, was actually saying, look, you've asked for X number of use cases, but let's focus on delivering the first 10. And we had a great sort of round the table discussion in our offices, going through the various potential use cases that they'd come along, understanding, some of the risks and threats and challenges that we presented to them, and from their own understanding as SOC experts, and that helped us to kind of identify a core set of use cases that we wanted to go live with first, that helped to tackle some of those kind of key threats and challenges that we had, and then we had to flex our implementation plan to make sure that we got the right log sources in, because it's all well and good, if you make your implementation objectives too technical, you can fly along ticking boxes and feeling great about yourselves, and your project is green because you've implemented 100 log sources or whatever it may be, or 2 gigabytes of data a day. But if those aren't the right log sources to deliver the use cases that are actually going to provide benefit to you, you're probably on a bit of a fool's errand there. So that was something that we learned very quickly, and I'm very grateful that Adarma, they were very helpful in that process with us.
Yeah, I think you made a couple of really good points that I guess just to emphasize a little bit. So we, our I guess my primary role is building MDR services, and one of the things that we often see, for the biggest reason why these projects delay, is that the security, or the MDR buyer hasn't kind of got buy-in from the rest of the teams, and essentially what that can lead to is significant delays in getting the infrastructure built out, potentially for the forwarding tier. That's particularly prevalent if, for example, your network is managed or your infrastructure is managed by a third party. So build in, if you have a time for any kind of networking changes to be made, or if you've got a delay in procuring infrastructure, you need to make sure that that's all really well understood almost before your partner gets on the park, so that we can start building that those timelines in place. And even for things such as putting agents onto boxes, we've all got colleagues in other teams that get very hesitant when you start talking about putting increasing number of agents on devices. So one of the things that Clark's did on those workshops is brought up the platform lead, the networking lead, and we had those discussions right up front, and that allowed us just to kind of tee up almost our core requirements that the Clarks were able to implement broadly before we even started. So we actually were able to start delivering value very, very quickly. And I guess, yeah, the second thing is that requirement to be agile. We were I think for Clarks, we're delivering a number of different products. Our typical model is we deliver enterprise products or enterprise technology, which we then provide services on top of. So for example, if we're using Splunk, it's an environment that's owned by the client and they have access to it. So you can actually then track very clearly as a client, make sure that your supplier are doing what they say they're going to do, because you can actually see the value being added to a technology product that you own. And one of the things that I think, you know, allow us to talk about is the ability to have that agile approach and not expect to be hung up change notices. You know, we should ask those questions, I think, really early on around the approach to contractual change, you know, and how flexible your partner is going to be. You know, for example, we've got a typical onboarding approach that, you know, on a rough, it generally takes about 12 weeks from start to end. And for example, you know, we might not look to bring in the Tenable component of that till week 8, week 9, week 10. But in this particular case, you know, the client will come and say, actually, no, we want that done first because we've got a reason for doing it. And you need somebody that's going to be able on day one to come in, start to build out that project plan and not dictate it to you, but build it in partnership with you together. And then not run to the sales team and look for uplifts. So, you know, I think that was something that was really pleasing when we were working with Clarks, is they were really open with where they wanted us to focus and allowed us to then build a plan that, you know, to Sean's point, allowed us to hit those gates in a kind of agile manner. We're able to bring services into production quicker for certain areas as we were continuing to build out the technology in the others. And I think that's, you know, that's something that's really, really kind of important to consider when building MDR. You know, MDR really should be a relatively agile deployment. You get data in, you can create content for that data, you can then push that content into production SOC whilst you're still onboarding the rest of your content. You know, it doesn't have to be that kind of big bang component at the end, depending on exactly kind of how you're planning to structure your onboarding process. So it can have that flexibility. And I think having recognition that there's going to be challenges during a project and you may have trouble getting data source X, well, actually, you then just need to focus on something else, pick that up and push that to the front of the queue. And again, having that agility in a program just allows you to gauge success and gain success quicker and not kind of be hung up on, you know, areas where you're simply not going to meet the deadlines because you've got dependencies outside of your control. And I think that's something that it's a way that we like to work and a way that we find particularly successful when clients work with us with that kind of agile approach.
Yeah, that was definitely something that we recognised through the RFP process. Is there were clearly vendors who, you know, were sort of preferable towards the big bang approach. You know, it was ingest these, you know, provide us with these log sources, and then we will go live on this given date. And of course, you could kind of tell that if you couldn't get those log sources in, that you were going to miss that data. And as Rory said, we were able to use much more of a kind of agile approach, and that's sort of agile with a little a, to make sure that we were kind of delivering benefits really early on. Almost through the kind of testing phase was actually a delivery phase, which was fantastic. And you know, it goes back to the point during the RFP as well, is that, you know, use their expertise, have those open conversations with them. It may be that, you know, they will have done this multiple times before, and they will tend to know which log sources are the kind of log sources that tend to present challenges. They will tend to know, you know, which of your maybe third-party suppliers that you're relying upon to provide some of those log sources, for example, tend to perhaps be some of the more difficult ones who, you know, maybe drag their heels. So, you know, you may have kind of an objective of delivering some use cases that are dependent upon those, but actually being able to have that kind of two-way dialogue and rely upon their expertise to say, look, our experience is that if you try and get these log sources from this particular supplier, you know, they say it's a 2-week turnaround, but reality is we often, you know, we're waiting 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks for those. So why don't we prioritize these log sources so that we can go live with this particular element of the service? And that was something that was really, really beneficial for us during the implementation phase.
I think that makes sense. And actually, I think I'm kind of going slightly off topic here, but one of the best questions that I think, you know, we like being asked when an RFP is for clients to say, well, what's your expectations on us? You know, what are we going to have to do to make this a success? Because ultimately, if you're buying a service to kind of, you know, hang on the side of your business and expect it just to operate, I think it'd be reasonable to kind of expect that you will have a limited service from that function. So kind of asking, well, how do we help make it successful and ensure, for example, there's weekly updates between both the SOCs or the relevant SOC providers, or our engineers are speaking regularly, allows us to help work together and say, well, for our service to work effectively and work as best as it possibly can, we probably need a couple of days of time on a weekly basis from the client security function to make sure that we're building the right content, make sure that we continue to be up to date with what the current business and kind of core threats and risks to the business are. And that allows us to help focus on making sure that the content we continue to roll out for clients and continues to be relevant to them as a business. Because, we often say that we consider ourselves experts in SOC, but we're not experts in the particular client. The client is. So for Clarks, they know better than us what's changing within your kind of business requirements, how your business is starting to operate. Obviously, the last year has been really interesting, and how things have had to change to operate. We're not going to drop the C word on this call, but it's kind of sorry. But as a result of that, some of the controls we're going to implement need to change. If you've gone from historically a principally kind of bricks and mortar based organization, and that then starts to become, the focus is delivering kind of web sales or internet-based sales, the content we're going to have to create to ensure that that service is protected is going to change. And so having that alignment regularly and having those constant feedback sessions between, for me, it's just the SOC of which we're a part of that, are massively important to ensuring that you can get success. So I do think it's worth, again, considering when you're selecting a provider, how much work we're going to have to do to make that a success, and ask that question up front, and make sure that you have the requisite support within your business to ensure that the service can be managed effectively and have successful outcomes.
That's a really good point there, Rory. And I think, it's easy to kind of think about, as you tend to do with many projects, you think about the go live date as being a static date, and you've kind of done the implementation, and then you're moving forward from there on. And actually what's really important is to continually evolve the service. So almost you implement and you sort of go live in inverted commas, but you should, as far as possible, and I'm not saying that we've necessarily achieved this as much as we might have liked, given the challenges of 2020 that no doubt we'll go on to into a minute. But don't be afraid to continually evolve the service, and actually don't recognize it as a failure if actually 3 months into the service you almost feel like you're taking a U-turn and reprioritizing some of your use cases. That's actually a benefit and a strength. We're here as security professionals to help the business achieve its objectives. And if there are business events, whether internal or external, that kind of change the strategic direction of your business, then we do need to be really flexible. So like I said, for me, implementation should be considered a kind of ever-going phase. You're continually implementing and continually evolving, and you probably shouldn't ever think of it as we've gone live and now that's it. It kind of will just sit there for 3 years, because the reality is, if you let it sit there, I guess it's a bit like the kind of Formula One team analogy, that if you don't continually develop, you're going to go backwards. And I think it's the same with your MDR service, that you do need to continually re-implement and make sure that you're getting the best value for service.
Thank you. And I think as a follow-on from that, very much part and parcel of this, can you speak at all about some of these outcomes and how things are currently going and how things might change in the future? To you, Rory, perhaps.
Yeah. So I think in terms of outcomes, I think not to kind of keep going on the point that Sean just mentioned there, but I think it's really important. I'm obsessed with this book at the moment called The End of Competitive Advantage, and it's all about that you have to be able to be agile as things change. And if you continue down a path that's been documented, or a strategy that's been implemented 6 months ago, well, it's probably more or less out of date within 6 weeks of that time. So, one of the things that we have, I think, successfully done in partnership with Clarks is be able to reprioritize as things have changed within Clarks as a business. So for me, initially it may have been focused on a particular use case, but as things start to change, we can be reprioritized to do other work. And what that allows, and as a result of that, we're constantly amending our roadmap of deployment of content. I won't go into specifics necessarily, but there's been some changes that have meant we then had to change what we detect and what we monitor for. And as a result of that, we're able to then show direct business outcomes to the kind of the exec or the C-level, say, well, as a result of change in business, we've reprioritized the SOC to detect the following outcomes. And we've actually identified particular behavior in a few areas that otherwise you wouldn't have seen. So I think, that for me is, I guess when you talk about outcomes, it's constantly evolving outcomes and constant change. And that, a SOC has to constantly change because attackers constantly change and risks constantly change, and the environment constantly changes. And that for me is why you need to have a really open and positive dialogue between partner and client at all times, even when potentially things aren't going exactly how you want them to go. It's about having a grown-up conversation together and saying, well, actually, we'd like you to focus in a specific area. I guess getting into specifics, one of the pleasing things we've started to see is really focus and move our service away from what would be kind of typically a managed detection service. For a long time, kind of managed SOC services have been very good at telling a client, for example, that you've got a bleeding leg. We've seen something happen to your leg, but it's over to you to go and fix it. By starting to bring in kind of EDR and SOAR solutions into the service, we're actually able to wrap a bandage on that leg and not phone Sean and get him out of bed at 2 o'clock in the morning when we see something malicious going on. So it's very much, again, to kind of focus on that NIST framework, having enough trust over time in your supplier to allow them to move from detection kind of into that respond and take action, is a really pleasing kind of maturity journey for us, and hopefully, as I say, keep Sean and his team from having to work too often at the weekends. And that's something that we just then, we'll look to continue to evolve. It may initially be network containment. Once we have trust in your supplier to then take that containment device, it might actually end up being, okay, well, actually, we're happy if you go and remediate those issues, with the capability that's available, for example, in some of the EDR products. So it's not just about, it's very much about creating content and ensuring that we continue to plug potential gaps in controls by monitoring both the external and internal threat landscape. But it's then also about how far can we ask our MDR provider to take action on our behalf, and how much trust do we have? So, we're kind of going two different ways when we think about the outcomes and the improvements that the MDR service is able to provide. So I think both are important when considering what you're looking for from a SOC provider, not just how do you detect things, but also how much do you want them involved in the kind of detect, contain, remediate component of response.
I think from our perspective, it's always difficult to come up with metrics where you can measure the success of an MDR service sort of implementation. I think if we took a kind of pure assurance and kind of a based approach, then yes, we repeated the maturity assessment that we undertook from the cybersecurity consultants from before the cybersecurity program, and we've repeated that again. And we've seen our kind of detection and response from the NIST cybersecurity framework at the areas where we've seen the greatest growth. And they've kind of really commended the amount of progress we've made there in the time since our original assessment. But for me, actually, there are kind of two kind of core areas where I personally see a significant amount of benefit from the outcomes. Firstly, it's getting visibility of things that we just didn't have visibility of before. As Rory said, that might be certain behaviors from external or internal actors. And then actually the rapid pace through which either we or Adarma can respond. As Rory said, it's really refreshing that not only can we be told that we've got a bleeding leg, to use his analogy, but actually, they can actually start to apply the bandage, and then we've got the expertise of their kind of SOC teams and various escalation teams that if we need to go back and say, okay, we're struggling in terms of how we would respond to this particular situation, that we've got that advice on hand as well. Or if actually we're concerned that maybe that particular alert is symptomatic of perhaps a broader situation, and asking them to go away and conduct some threat hunts. I can think of a case recently where, luckily it was benign, but something cropped up on a Friday sort of afternoon. And rather than trying to scrabble around to think, who in my team can I persuade to do some work over the weekend during the Euro Championships, we actually had the benefit of having the SOC teams there who could go off and run some kind of threat hunts just to validate some of our concerns. So that was fantastic. And the other kind of benefit for me on a personal level, is that 2020 has been an incredibly challenging year for for a lot of organizations. And, you know, as a global retailer, we've certainly seen our fair share of those. And, you know, it's actually given us the flexibility to take various decisions, you know, and some of them may not be decisions that we'd like to take, but we've had to respond to the, you know, the business environment that we're in. And having that MDR service has given us the flexibility to take some of those decisions or change the direction we've gone in certain areas without unduly kind of increasing our security risk, which, you know, is fantastic because it really does help you sleep at night.
Well, thank you very much. I think you've provided a very thorough overview of the whole process, and I think it's very, very helpful to the audience. I think moving on from there, we're just going to move on to some questions from the audience, if that's okay, and if neither of you have got anything else to add on the whole process.
Happy with that?
That sounds good.
Wonderful. So, so the first question I've got is to Sean. Is there anything you'd do differently if you had the chance to start your MDR journey again?
It's a really interesting question, and you know, don't want to be looking back with rose-tinted glasses. As I said, you know, it really felt like quite a successful implementation, and I think, you know, the kind of core sort of indicator of that was that we had an official go live date, which ended up being a complete non-event. I guess it was probably more of an event for Adarma because it meant that they officially had turned the service on and probably could start charging us for it. But for us as the customer, it really was a non-event. We'd already seen significant value from the service, and as far as we were concerned on a day-to-day operations point of view, you know, we were already getting those benefits, so that was fantastic. I think there are a couple of areas where, you know, and actually there were probably less during the implementation phase, but more moving on to the business as usual phase. And something that I've personally learned quite recently is that actually there is that need to continually evolve. And I think we can all get lost in business as usual. And you know, the service is great in that there is continued improvement, and we have an engineer who supports us in fine tuning, and that really is fantastic. But I think, you know, something that I've learned and we'll take forward with the service is having those you know, higher level catch ups to kind of talk strategy and talk about, you know, the direction that the business is going, and making sure that, you know, we really do operate as a partnership and not just as a vendor. And, you know, I'd say we're 80% of the way there, and a lot of that's on us as an organization to make sure that we're fully utilizing the services that are available through Adarma, and to make sure that we are, you know, always on the front foot. You know, in terms of the future, we've seen that the last 18 months have indicated that, you know, not only is the only constant is change, but actually that change is happening faster than we've ever thought before. And, you know, we're a nearly 200-year-old medium to large size retailer, and we have all the kind of technology baggage that comes with that. We've actually had to start acting in many ways like a startup, and at the kind of pace of a startup in some of the ways that we, you know, communicate with, and the ways that we serve our customers, and the way that we interact with our customers. And we've had to deliver things at far quicker pace than we've ever done before. And, you know, as a security function, we need to keep up with that pace to remain relevant to the business. So I think it's going to be really good to make sure going forward that we do have that ongoing dialogue with Adarma as a partnership, to make sure that they're kept in the loop with those strategic decisions. And hopefully therefore it's less of you know, me picking up the phone or dropping an email saying we urgently need to do this, and perhaps it might be a little bit more planned from our side going forward.
I think that's very interesting, sort of the evolution of how services from IT vendors has to work for it to be sort of effective. And so I've got another question. This is one for you, Rory. So are there any examples of major incidents that you've prevented for any of your customers? And I know you have to be very cagey about what you can say here, but anything you can share would be brilliant.
Yeah, so I won't get into any specifics, but yes, I mean, I think there's a couple of areas, and I think there's two that I would possibly focus on. So externally, you know, from kind of external threat actors, you know, we are seeing an uptick in kind of spear phishing and phishing attacks that we're able to detect. I think business email compromise is something that's massively prevalent at the moment. We're seeing a huge uptick in that, and being able to have detective controls in place that allow us to understand that third-party suppliers may have been compromised. You know, just with some of the recent kind of media coverage for other third-party supplier attacks, a kind of island hopping position, is something that I think we're all going to have to spend a lot more time building out additional controls in. That's something that we do have. We can use a number of different ways to do that. We either use our threat intelligence platform for kind of more indicator-led detections, for which we have seen a number of detections and managed to stop that. And equally, from some of the kind of more kind of email-based logging rules that we can put in place, we've been able to identify a lot of phishing attacks. And what's kind of, I guess, cards on the table, it's often difficult when you stop something before it's happened because you've identified a phish and deleted the email from the mailbox. You often don't make a massive song and dance about it, because actually it's not the ransomware outbreak that it could have been. It's just business as usual, us doing our job. But that's the type of thing that a SOC will do regularly. Whether that's it's a managed provider or it's a dedicated SOC that you build yourself. And I think being able to try and figure out how to call those successes out is massively important. One of the other areas that we see quite regularly, actually, unfortunately, is the kind of insider risk. So we've got a lot of use cases that we position around things like high risk levers, to ensure that if somebody does look to exit the business, they're not going to try and take information away with them. And unfortunately, as people move organizations, that's something that we do see a lot of. Often I think it's probably not particularly malicious for people, but it's them thinking, well, I've done all this work, I need to take it with me when I go somewhere else. But that's a massive security issue and can potentially expose a significant amount of revenue loss to the business. So I guess for a couple of examples, that's kind of some of the information that we see regularly, some of the stuff we see a lot of. And then you've got all of your kind of standard detections around kind of lateral movement that we do see, kind of, if we're not managing to detect stuff at that kind of delivery stage. But we are seeing both an increase in kind of external based attacks, but it's also important to kind of spend time focusing on that insider risk, and we are seeing detections in both. And I think bluntly, if either of those had been successful, there's a very real chance that the cost to the business could well have been more than the investment you had to make in the SOC in the first place. So I guess kind of linked to that point is, don't expect your SOC to be detecting high level attacks every single day. Actually, it's enough if you stop a couple of, I guess you stop the couple that happen every year and are able to report those up into your relevant execs to call it the success of the SOC. It's not how many widgets have the SOC performed this month isn't really a metric of success. It's how many attacks have we detected and helped keep ourselves or keep our customers safe. That's a difficult question to answer without getting into massive specifics. Hopefully I've given a flavor.
Well, I think that's very helpful, because it's only organisations like yours that have this, true panoramic view of what's going on. So it's very interesting. And we've got another question, which is in a way like a sister question to that, to you, Rory. So are you noticing any types of trends and the types of threats your customers are facing, or incidents you're stopping? Does it match what Rory's seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, I think there's, sorry, no worries. there is, we are I mean, for me, supplier and third party supply chain risk is just becoming massively aware. Obviously we're seeing some significantly high profile attacks that are kind of essentially kind of island hopping attacks. And for me, that's something that we're seeing a lot of. And actually, if we go right back to the start, it's something that would actually making more work for me, but advise that you start to include in your RFP, if you're purchasing an MDR service, what is your approach to mitigating supply chain risk or making sure that we're not a jumping off point for a wider attack? Because I think that's, there is no doubt that MSSPs are relatively, or a target. If you manage to exploit, you have footprint and access into potentially hundreds of different accounts. So we are absolutely seeing a significant change, both in the kind of, I guess, detection that we need to do in that, but also a little bit higher at the kind of strategic level, which is, I think it's becoming a critical risk for most businesses who use third-party suppliers. And actually embedding those kind of questions when you're selecting a vendor, I think something that's really important, and we'll continue to grow over kind of the next couple of years.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much to Rory and Sean for sharing your advice today. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, so I hope everyone at home has enjoyed the webinar. Just a quick reminder that the session will be available on demand from tomorrow, and do look below the video screen to find more links to some of the other pieces in the Minimising the Impact of a Breach series in partnership with Adarma. I mean, we've got a whole podcast series, additional webinars. I mean, there's absolutely tons of content covering lots of different areas of threats with lots of different people in discussion. So thank you very much for joining us today and for taking part. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.